All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelsey Jones, and I'm a Senior Program Manager with the National Association of State Energy Officials, or NASEO. And I'm looking forward to moderating this webinar on engaging with tribal nations and local communities around clean hydrogen. This topic of partnering with and working with tribal nations and local communities is a big priority for many states, particularly as they explore opportunities to develop a clean hydrogen economy within their states and regions. And obviously, while this topic deserves much more time than just 1 hour, we hope this webinar can really just be a good jumping off point and help to direct states to potential resources and contacts as they conduct stakeholder and tribal engagement. We want to really highlight some of the potential questions and concerns that may be posed to states around clean hydrogen and how to articulate some of those potential benefits. And before we get started, I also wanted to mention that NASEO will be developing a toolkit for states on clean hydrogen, which will explore this issue in much more detail and hopefully serve as a good resource for state energy offices and other state governments. And as you can see, we will be recording this webinar and also sharing the slides with registrants sometime next week, so you can utilize these as a resource or share with any colleagues that might not have been able to attend. So we do have a great lineup of speakers for you today. We're going to walk through a set of presentations before we open things up to Q&A. We are in Zoom webinar format, so only the hosts and presenters are on screen. So please enter any questions you have for the speakers into the Q&A box, and we will address them following the speakers' remarks. And if you do have any technical issues or questions during the webinar, please message myself or my colleague, Grace Lowe. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our three speakers today. First up, we will have Michelle Fox with the U.S. Department of Energy's Hydrogen Fuel Cell Technologies Office, followed by Hadia Shirazi with Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy, and finishing up with Daniel Cardenas with the National Tribal Energy Association. So really looking forward to a great discussion and great presentations today. I'll turn it over to Michelle to get us started.
Thank you very much. Really delighted to join you today, and wanted to be able to share a few reflections on our office's environmental justice strategy, how we're evolving to incorporate energy and environmental justice into all the ways we do business. So with that, if I could have the next slide, please. I have to begin by saying DOE personnel are prohibited from communicating with applicants regarding open funding announcements and except through the established question and answer process. I'm really sorry for that disclaimer. So I just don't want you guys to think I'm not trying to answer your questions or be honest, but we're under that requirement. Now that that's done, onto the substance I can actually talk about. So the Justice 40 initiative and the movement for a just transition have really had this transformative impact on the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Technology Office and across the federal government. We are among the covered programs for whom the 40% of benefits of our investment should flow to disadvantaged communities. And so to begin, I have this graphic from the DOE National Clean Hydrogen Strategy and Roadmap, where you can see that energy and environmental justice on the right-hand side has been recognized as an enabler for the scale up of the hydrogen economy. So to make that concrete, I'll focus on how community engagement has really changed the impact and had such a huge impact on all we're doing. I've included a quick summary of some of the other changes underway, but I'd really like to focus up in conversations after this if you'd like to learn more about those areas. It just isn't time to sort of cover everything we're doing because, as I say, in some respects, the focus on EJ has really touched every single aspect of our program. So next slide, please. Since its inception, DOE's hydrogen program has really been primarily research and development focused. And I'm probably not telling you anything you didn't know, but stakeholder engagement frequently meant holding meetings with academia or end users, industry, to discuss electrolyzers and fuel cells. And our standard process had always been using requests for information, webinars, technical workshops, and senior leaders have prepared remarks and, especially for major milestones. And I'm sure most of you sitting in the audience have participated in some of these. So, all of this was conducted in English, and it requires, a level of expertise, both and a level of effort to participate. And it's the world we've become comfortable with. Next slide, please. But with the advent of the Justice 40 executive order, we began a system-wide rethink of how we can make our programs more accessible and more user-friendly. So this may be true for some of your organizations, but most of the people I work with are engineers, physicists, and chemists, and these disciplines are not always focused on the human element. So with environmental justice, we're now adding a whole different dimension to our work, where we have to ask, what's the potential human impact of our deployments, and who will benefit, who might suffer, and do we even know? And so community engagement is really this very new concept for DOE, but there's a growing recognition of its importance. This slide is a high-level version of our energy, equity, and environmental justice strategy that's in development. And as you can see, listening, engaging, and increasing transparency is the first pillar or priority area. And what this means in practice is that we are now broadening what we mean by stakeholders to recognize the importance of listening and engaging with marginalized and disadvantaged communities. And it's really important for communities to be able to identify the real benefits and potential risks from DOE-funded projects. And it's not just a good thing to do, but some of you may know that communities are now stopping projects. And so it's really critical that we recognize the importance of engaging them early and often in the process. So this concerted effort to expand our outreach, has really informed a lot of the other pillars in our EEJ strategy. But what's the most effective and reliable strategies to listen to concerns and gain perspectives from community groups that haven't typically been involved with DOE solicitations, but have important perspectives? And how can we really center historically excluded voices to ensure the equitable distribution of benefits? What are the tools that both bolster trust and increase transparency, and not just a check the box exercise? And finally, what metrics should we be collecting to evaluate the efficacy of what we're doing? And we're still trying to answer many of these questions. I wish that I could tell you I had like absolute hard and fast answers to all those, but what we are aiming for is a community-centered approach. So for example, thinking about what would be good for communities, not what our timeline is, and what's relevant for their needs, what's their preferred method for interaction, what's the cadence of communication that they would like. And of course, we have to consider all that while still balancing our own timelines and priorities. So we're taking some really concrete steps to get to a solution. And if you could put the next slide up, please. So we're adding to our previous methods of engagement with listening sessions for those who might not have time to respond to RFI requests for information, or for those who might have challenges with internet access or basic literacy or English. And it's a crucial early step is to do research before we tap communities for engagement. It's really important to unearth previous involvement with DOE to perform our own social characterization assessment. And through listening sessions, we've learned a lot of effective practices, including like sending invitations long in advance and scheduling outside of normal business hours, providing multiple channels for sharing of information, and considering non-traditional meeting spaces. And a lot of those best practices have been distilled into the community benefits plan guidance for the hydrogen hubs. And there's a link to that document if you haven't already found it, and it's included at the end of my slides. But we're really pivoting also to prioritize place-based meetings that can provide accommodation for non-English speakers, persons with disabilities. And I think place-based visits have raised our awareness of unique circumstances, geographies, lived experiences, and community priorities. I mean, I know that site visits are particularly important and carry significance for working with tribes. These experiences really can help us move from a one-size-fits-all to programs and policies that can be tailored for the region. So we're also trying to move away from engagement as a one-way, one-time transmission of information into a dialogue. And I want to make it clear that some of this work on engagement is being led by DOE, but some of it will be led by those whom we fund, especially through the community benefits plans requirements. And so we're in the process of exploring how DOE can do better in all of this. So next slide, please. I think the most visible sign of incorporating environmental justice and equity is in the inclusion of those community benefits plans. And thankful that Hadia will cover more detail on those, but I'm sure you guys have probably already seen that there are different goals for R&D projects versus D&D projects. And we can spend a lot more detail in uncovering what the goals of those are. And there's a lot of work to providing accurate information to communities, and we would love to partner with states in these efforts. So communities need to be able to understand the technology, and developers need to be able to understand the regional, local, and or tribal context. But the longer term goal is to facilitate the co-creation of technologies with communities and potentially tap new sources of innovation and workforce. Our initial efforts have already surfaced a host of issues that non-traditional applicants have faced, ranging from our funding opportunity announcement process to the challenges of benefiting from the jobs that we hope will be created. So listening and engaging, therefore, also helps inform those efforts, including around the hydrogen workforce. It needs to not only reflect the nation's diversity, but also should reflect the communities in which deployments happen. And we can't do that without learning more about frontline and fence line communities. In an effort to lower other barriers to participation, we've begun using other funding mechanisms, including prizes and challenges. We found these to be less burdensome, have less aggressive timelines, and allow for community-led applications. We're also issuing notices of intent as far in advance as we are allowed to enable new applicants to prepare to respond. We've been expanding our pool of reviewers and recruiting special purpose reviewers. And this has the knock-on effect of helping involve new audiences, help new voices identify what they see as important and meaningful, and share their perspective with the technical reviewers and help potential applicants see what makes for a good proposal. We've created teaming lists in which interested entities can self-identify. And this again opens more opportunities for those who may not be ready to serve as a prime, but could be part of a team and learn more along the way. And finally, we've developed an innovative platform with the H2 Matchmaker. There's a little illustration of what it looks like there, and I encourage you to go explore if you haven't already. It was specifically launched for the hubs, and each dot corresponds to a hydrogen activity that a broadly defined stakeholder has contributed. But it has a great opportunity sort of to allow us to surface historically marginalized or underserved communities that want to participate. And this tool, or one like it, can help drive greater diversity within teams applying and open up the pool of applicants. So next slide. Challenges remain. We hear about overburdened communities with requests and burnout among respondents. We need to be more intentional, especially when looking at ways to coordinate efforts across our department, agency, and government, and share knowledge to reduce the impact on overburdened communities. And then we need to scale what works. What does a standard of care look like for community engagement? One effort we have underway that we're just starting is a shared calendar to log who we're meeting with, agenda items, and major takeaways. So we're just starting that, and stay tuned to see how it works, but we're hoping it'll help take some of the additional meetings that are causing a lot of stress on communities. We also need to consider supporting each other and recognizing our own capacity limits. We're all really stretched tight. I'm sure you guys are too. And it takes a lot of staff to do this correctly. So it may take some training and conversations to make energy justice, part of the routine skills that all engineers have, but we're working towards it. And in order to have a fruitful dialogue, we need to increase public awareness of hydrogen. So we're really considering creating graphically rich materials, frequently asked questions in multiple formats, languages, and platforms. And as part of this effort, we need to really be honest and address negative feedback from stakeholders candidly. So additional challenges remain. Cost share requirements exacerbate inequality. We're trying to solve some of that. Our funding opportunities are still a huge process and have not been streamlined. I dream of a common application process like we see for applying to colleges, but I think we're probably still a ways off from that. But offering smaller funding opportunities would be a great way to make a positive impact. We'd also like to explore options for direct remuneration and reaching communities and individuals, not community-based organizations, which is often who we're having conversations with. But as I say, it's still very new territory and we're learning. Next slide. There are lots and lots of resources online, and some of these links may be of interest to spark ideas for your own programs. I tried to curate a few that might be helpful to you. Please note, not all of these are from our office. I've included a few resources from different parts of the agency, ranging from our Community Benefits Agreement Toolkit, the Quick Start for FOA's funding opportunities that our colleagues in geothermal have created. I think it's really lovely. It's a visual graphic to help applicants quickly determine if they're interested and eligible. And I know that may sound like a small step. It took a lot to get that through, and we're trying to look at what the opportunity space is to help people quickly identify if this is for them or not, instead of reading 150-page application. So I want to shout out to our friends in geothermal who did that. And last slide, finally, please save the date for what is a very traditional in-person meeting on, it's our annual merit review in June in the DC area. And of course, I can't fail to put in a plug for Hydrogen Day, which occurs every October 8th because of hydrogen's atomic weight. We hold activities around this day, and it's a fun thing to sort of build grassroots support for hydrogen. So with that, next slide just has my contact information. And I want to encourage you, let's make this a dialogue, and please get in touch to share your perspectives about what's worked and what you're thinking about. And I'd love to learn and hear from you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that great overview. And over to you, Hadia.
Thank you, Kelsey. Next slide, please. So I want to start very quickly by saying, explaining a little bit about what I do. I work at an energy think tank that's based at a university. So most of my job is really managing a research team and kind of getting our publications through the pipeline, organizing public-private events, and a lot of partnerships with governments and private sector. And then my own research focus has been looking at the community and local impacts of deploying clean energy technologies like hydrogen and carbon management in general. And I particularly am keen to focus on disadvantaged communities and historically marginalized stakeholder groups within these communities. So I look at youth, I look at persons with disabilities, and also at now refugees. The reason I want to flag this report up front is that this is a great resource, and I'm not just saying that because I helped write it, but this is one of the 4 reports that have been named as the most widely read commentaries on hydrogen leakage and risks as of last year. And so I've shared the links to all the work by our colleagues as well at EDF, at Strathclyde, and I believe the European Commission. So you'll have a copy of these slides so you can review them. I'm going to go into what this work was in a minute. Next slide, please. So public trust. The reason I want to start here a little bit is and if we can go to the next slide, please, is when I started to think about this work last year, and this is or the year before last, actually, well before we had any money in the field for hydrogen hubs, was that I was trying to understand, partially from having seen how carbon capture was faring, and it was faring poorly, often in the public policy arena in terms of public support and public opinion. I was worried that, or concerned that with hydrogen, we were going to encounter similar issues, even if it was green hydrogen. And I started to look into different studies to try to understand what were good tools and ways to engage with communities. And one of the things I've read over and over is to understand the global context, like the overall landscape in which you are trying to engage with people. And so we have just gone through, as a global community, we have just gone through a pandemic, we have gone through energy crisis, we have runaway inflation, high levels of unemployment, and all of that has obviously shapes people's perceptions of public institutions and the people that are in them. And so I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot to illustrate that the Pew Center found that people's confidence in medical scientists and scientists, journalists, business leaders, and elected officials had actually declined over the last year, and it has been declining, I would say, in the last 2 to 3 years. So that's just sort of important to understand when we're thinking about building coalitions and like who's going to be talking to people. Again, this study was limited to about 14,000 people. It doesn't, represent everyone in the United States. But typically, this is why we do surveys, is to get, a sense of the temperature. So next slide, please. This is, just to say that really important is the local context after the backdrop of everything that's happening. And for that, there's some really great books that talk about local examples in communities all across the United States. So it's everything from water pollution, air pollution, ground pollution, looking at the historical practices of redlining and the connections to environmental and energy pollution in communities that have very obvious links to race. So understanding the context of what has happened in that particular community, which state agencies have that unique position of having that view, and understanding that because you hear so often from different NGOs, from community organizers, from people in the community. But but for those that maybe in the development side might be new to that area, or newer to the project, or newer to that community, this would be a really good idea to actually like read up as much as you can about what has happened in that community, in that state in the past. And then I would also suggest at the same time is to take a very close look at the developer's own relationship, which, you know, it shouldn't be a surprise. There will be if they've been a long-term developer, and given that this is a demonstration project, there will be a long history of their impact, both positive and negative, in the community. And so understanding that will be really, really important for prep work. Next slide, please. So community benefit agreements. This, we can go through the next slide. Transparency, next slide. Inclusion, accessibility, next slide. Commitment, next slide. Feedback. So here I just want to pause for a second. There is an interesting history of community benefit agreements in the United States. So traditionally they started, really to accompany large development projects, real estate development projects. So I think there are some great examples that many of you might know or remember. The Staples Center, certainly. We had a project in Seattle, I think it was called the Dearborn Goodwill project in Seattle. There was the Gates Cherokee project in Denver. There's a ballpark village in San Diego. So there's some great success stories of how these projects have worked well, but there are also lots of stories, particularly in the case of New York, that I know of, that I've read about, that I've heard about from my neighbors, from people I've gone to school with, that people I've worked with, people that have long memories of, because of being long-term residents of New York, of community benefit agreements that didn't go well. And unfortunately, most of the time, those experiences then, there is intergenerational memory within communities. There is memory that transcends sector. So it doesn't necessarily mean they only feel that way about real estate developers. They may feel that way about energy developers as well. Then there's also the fact that, there's a big criticism of CBAs that they don't typically ensure that everyone's interests are reflected and captured. It's typically because it's really hard to do. You can't capture everybody in the state or everybody in the disadvantaged community. So you look for champions or representatives or leaders within, or faith-based groups within community organizations, disability advocacy groups, small businesses, different chambers of commerce. You try to identify different leaders that represent various groups of people, but they will never represent everybody. So in some cases, some groups have been excluded deliberately in different contexts in different parts of the country. And then that creates also inequality and, doesn't set the CBA up for success. There have also been some questions about, the really practical aspects of, enforcing the CBA terms. Disadvantaged communities certainly, don't have the resources to, retain representation or to engage in some kind of legal action if there has been, there hasn't been followed through on what they were promised. So in that case, the state maybe then plays the role of, ensuring that the agreements that were signed are held to. Certainly in this case, we have the federal government that's overseeing, certain aspects of due diligence and accountability. But I just want to flag that that bit. And next slide, please. So in the community engagement context, next slide. The one thing that I want to say is that everything that we will be doing for the next several months is going to be hyper local. So what is happening in the Northeast hub is going to be completely different from Heartland, from all the other hubs all across. And I've been trying to track how many got approved to move to the next stage, but it's quite secretive. So I've only tracked, I think, about half of the ones that got approval. But I think it's really, it's exactly as Michelle said, there's no one solution for everybody. There's no one perfect way to do it. And, you know, I've seen stakeholder maps with the 15 groups, and I've seen them with 500, and I've drawn some of them. So what happens in that context, we're going to go into a few slides later on. It's really dependent on sort of how you decide to allocate those benefits, which communities you decide to identify as the ones that you're going to work with. And that will then shape a lot of what's happening, but it will be very, very localized. And therefore you understanding the overall history, the local history, the developer's history, and then that community's needs, that will, you know, really stand you in good stead moving forward. So next slide, please. This is an example that I really wanted to share just because it's like kind of a perfect example of all the things that could go wrong. And so it's a really good case study for learning purposes. And I've just highlighted some of the things that people have said in news reports that have been coming in the media for like several months now. The fact that a pilot project for installing, essentially, basically they're planning to supply green hydrogen or electrification via heat pumps to all the homes in these two tiny little coastal villages or towns in the northeastern part of England. Now, these are not like disadvantaged communities per se. They're fairly well-to-do communities. People are well educated, so it's not the typical example. But the reason it's interesting is that the gas company has sort of done all the things that one shouldn't really do. There are constituents that felt like they have not been consulted, that the project they're feeling like they're lab rats. There are people that are highly suspicious of the rumors that they've heard that, you know, hydrogen is explosive and it's very, very dangerous. They have not actually even heard back from the company in the cases that they've reached out to get answers to like very reasonable questions, like what happens after the trial is over? What if hydrogen becomes more expensive? Like, then do you want us to switch back to gas? Like, who's going to pay for that? Next slide, please. And the interesting bit is that the government and the energy companies are sort of like viewing this and saying, oh, like these are not they're worrying too much. Like, this is not reasonable. Like, we do safety and testing and, you know, 5 years of testing before we deploy anything, and they can always just pick electricity. Like, they don't have to do hydrogen. But from a community's perspective, there has already been enough of that fracture in the public trust from the first moment that fracture has now been, a stress fracture has now been turning into a real fracture. And it's going to become harder and harder for them to be able to pick one of these two towns for the pilot and for it to be successful enough. And at the same time, all the rest of the UK and the rest of the world is watching this. And what's fascinating is that people are not only trying to find out about hydrogen on their own, there are people in the community that are experts, they work in universities, you know, they work in NGOs that work on energy. So they also have an understanding of what's going on and they're feeling left out. So this is just to, you know, share, and you can read this later on. It's quite interesting. Next slide. So this was just, Michelle's done a wonderful job of like going through all of this already, so I don't want to really belabor it. The thing that I did want to talk about a little bit is that it's really important for the local team that's going to be on the ground, whether it's managing the project, whatever stage it is, production, storage, transportation, and use, wherever they're going to be in contact with people from the community. It's really good for people in the community to meet the developer via their representatives and to have an understanding of who are the people that are going to have managing this project, to have faith in their expertise. Connected to this, where I talk about the address the known risks and the unknown risks, there's a great way to partner, and most of the hubs are partnering with national labs, and they do these incredible demonstrations that partner with fire departments and their own scientists, and they show people exactly like, you know, how close can you get to a hydrogen flame? What does a hydrogen flame look like? You know, what happens when it comes into contact with a spark? Like, is that unsafe? How do we stay safe? Understanding fire codes, understanding safety codes, the more you can tell people, the more you can show them, actually, in fact, even more so, is helpful. So I mean, I spend way too much time probably on YouTube. Like, I love watching these hydrogen demonstration videos, but I learned so much from it. And I think that that would be a really great tool in engagement, not to do, webinars like we do, but to go out to the community, to invite people to actually engage with the technology, because that's how you shift perception. Next slide, please. So this is going to be very quick and really fun. Next slide, please. So I'm sure at this point, most people have watched The Glass Onion or have heard of it at the very least. I think as of Christmas, about 36 million households had watched it. I'm sure by now it's even more. What's really interesting about, what I thought was really interesting is that when the movie came out, I was expecting to get like bombarded with questions about like, oh my gosh, is this true? Like, does it really explode? Or like, can you actually carry it around in your pocket? I did not get those questions. And then I started asking some of my friends, I'm like, did you watch that? And they're like, yeah, it's wild, isn't it? And these are people, college educated, people I work with, people in the energy field, some of them not in technical capacities, but not very many people were like that preoccupied to go Googling to find out how much of this is true. The problem, I think, Netflix is wonderful for entertainment, but I think that for people to actually learn about hydrogen, I would rather it comes from people that are scientists and people that understand the technology and can explain it correctly, because you can't unring a bell, like, and I don't want to ruin it for those who haven't seen it, but there's a moment where one of the characters says, oh my God, we're going to turn people's homes into the Hindenburg. And that's it. You can't unring that bell. So now there'll be a lot more work that needs to be done to correct some of the misconceptions and, some of the creative license that was taken in making what was a great movie, but is fiction, is not reality. So next slide, please. I want to talk and this time, the reason I put in the resources already is I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you can absolutely expect communities to want to talk about leakage risk. They're going to want to talk about safety risk. And I've talked with different people. So people that are like working in metallurgy, people that work pipelines, people that are, chemical engineers. And we've confirmed a lot of the work that we've obviously published. But my understanding is that obviously if we know that there is methane leak at this point, there is this considerable amount, let me correct that, considerable amount of methane leak at the moment. So the molecule for hydrogen is far smaller than that of gas. So certainly it will escape the same way. And probably we don't know yet, we don't have good ways of measuring just how much. And the other part about it is obviously safety, is we don't want to have a situation where the blend is potentially explosive or has a safety risk. So next slide, please. The other two things that you will definitely get questions about are the warming potential and NOx. I remember being in discussions with various types of environmental and community groups, good mix, representing predominantly people of color, and NOx was sort of that hard line. And that is understandable because it literally leads to premature death, and it disproportionately impacts people of color, it impacts children, it impacts the elderly and people that already have pre-existing conditions. So that will be a really important question to address with the developers in each hub, to say, if you have the technology for those low NOx turbines that are referenced in the FOA, to be able to explain that technology, however you can, while protecting your trade secrets. But communities have to be able to understand that, the projects will not be adding to their existing air pollution burden. Similarly, from a climate perspective, there will be environmental groups that will want to understand what will be done to address the warming potential from the leakage. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this is something that I'm sure everyone has seen, so I don't want to spend really any time on it. I just had it here as a reference. Next slide. And this was just an example shared by DOE of just sort of some examples of metrics that you can have for how they measure benefits. Next slide. And then this, I was unable to share the research I'm doing because it's yet to be peer reviewed and published, so I'm not really allowed to share very much. But what I thought was really interesting is that if you look at the first table, 94% of the population, and then you have 52% of the population for Mississippi, 94% for Puerto Rico. So here you can very quickly immediately see that the percentage of people that are in disadvantaged communities, that's like concentrated. So you might, if you are in a hub or you have the ability to, focus your benefits, that's one way to identify where they should go. The other way is to look at the other table that's next to it, that's by country, and that's, by county, that's a typo, is to look at, like, for instance, the Bronx, right, which is in New York, where half population is in the disadvantaged category. Or like you can look at 6 and 7, where you've got 2 communities that are in Louisiana that are in disadvantaged category. So you might be able to sort of lump the benefits there. But eventually, once my piece comes out, I'll try to share it as soon as possible so that you can see how I've tried to group some of the numbers to think about where you can deploy benefits. Next slide. And then I'm going to do 2 very quick examples because I know I'm a little over time. One is just the fact that we have massive amounts of energy utility debt from COVID and a little bit before COVID, but the numbers have now, they're astronomical, and households are really, really burdened with this huge economic burden. And this is one of the indicators that are actually captured in the White House's tool. So, there is obviously potential for companies to consider providing a benefit, whether it's through a stipend, whether it's through some kind of a credit that's worked up with a utility to ease people's utility burdens, because energy poverty is, 1 in 3 households are energy insecure. So that's a great way to think about, how do we directly give a benefit to help communities that are struggling with bills. The next one, please. Superfund sites, I think, are another really interesting area, primarily because you already are working with developers that may, not all, but at least some of them, maybe half of them will have what is a PRP, maybe a PRP, which is a potentially responsible party, which means that they already have liability towards cleanup for 1 or more sites in 1 or more parts of the country. So if they're in the hub and there are Superfund sites near the hub in your state, that is a great place for them to be able to provide additional funding, because as you can see, these numbers are nowhere near enough for what is needed to actually clean up a Superfund site. And I put down some rough numbers that I pulled from the EPA website. So New Jersey, California, Pennsylvania, New York, Michigan, Texas, Florida, that's more than 50 of those sites are located in these states. So you can certainly think of that as an opportunity. Next slide, please. This is something I just wanted to talk about because I started to really notice that every time I was reading papers about hydrogen, green, blue, whatever color, there was sort of this assumption that water was just there. The water was just always just there. There's cost of electrolyzers, there's cost of electricity, there's a cost for the OPEX, CAPEX, and I was like, where is the price of water in this? Next slide, please. And the reason that really matters is that we are still in a mega drought. And this is one of the worst ones that we've seen in the last 1,200 years. Most parts of the country are incredibly water stressed. And if we go to the next slide, the 1 kilogram of hydrogen roughly is 9 liters of water. But then when you add in all the water you need for cooling and other purposes, that goes up to maybe about 11 liters. The FOA has a requirement for what needs to be produced daily. So there's a daily expectation of that much water needs to be available daily. And we have only finite sources of water. So if we're using, things like recycled water, I've seen some great projects where they've built plants and then they've sort of gifted them or given them back to the city to operate, and they're using the water from that. Desalination, which is, now becoming more and more popular as parts of the country become drier, and costs are coming down considerably, but there is an environmental impact for desalination because what's essentially left over after you've desalinated water is sort of a brine. And if that's put back into the ocean improperly, that can increase the salt levels essentially in water, and that's really harmful to marine life. So that, a lot more study needs to be done. I know that California has regulations, particularly on how that is handled. But I think that overall, if the hubs are any sign of what's to come, and we're looking at more and more salination, not just in the US, but around the world, that's going to be a big question. Next slide. And the last bit I want to talk about here too is that the reason I'm flagging this is that one potential benefit that companies could consider or developers could consider is helping out with water utility debt. because first of all, water is just not priced similarly at all. If you live in West Virginia versus you live in Wisconsin, completely different story. And so there are some of the stories I've read are just absolutely heartbreaking, of households that are just crippled under thousands of dollars of unpaid water debt. And you absolutely cannot live without water, right? So that is something that would be a really big benefit, and something that can help communities to think about that as well. So I'll stop here. I'm sorry, went way over, but thank you so much. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Hadia. Incredibly comprehensive, and I learned a lot. Now, I know, Daniel, you're up next without any slides. So Grace, if you want to stop sharing, take it away, Daniel.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Cardenas, and I'm the chairman, CEO of National Tribal Energy Association. And so I'll speak a little bit. I got a couple minutes to before questions for my bit, but I'll just keep it short. One of the things I wanted to mention after the two speakers was just a blanket statement to say that community engagement, tribal engagement, all the engagement under the Justice 40 initiative, specific to the hydrogen hub competition, but also all the other monies that DOE is dispersing through the infrastructure and the Inflation Reduction Act, needs to be part of the DNA of those project developers. And I mean, I say that, but I know that a lot of them, they're already moving forward, so it's not part of their DNA. And then our communities just become a check mark on an application. But if I was in charge, I would make sure that that was clear, that these projects need to eat, sleep, wake up. Everything that they do has to be community engagement has to be involved from beginning to the end. And so I just wanted to say that, and that's sort of my litmus test for any projects and their viability, feasibility, or whether they ultimately are successful. One thing I wanted to mention as well, obviously, when we're talking about states and tribal and community engagement, obviously the hydrogen hub competitions are going to be, there's various 7 or 8 of them. 4 is the minimum, but some states won't be covered, some communities won't be covered. And so as we move forward with this conversation, specifically around hydrogen, states still need to be involved. Even if their region or states don't win the competition, there's still going to be interactions with tribes, and tribal communities. And so obviously those states already have histories, they're already doing various things, and they're already engaging with tribes. One of the groups that's always sometimes is forgotten when states are dealing with tribes and tribal governments and their leaders is tribal communities that are not on reservation, particularly in more heavily populated states on the east and west coasts. There are a lot of urban and suburban Native Americans who are members of all kinds of different tribes who are in those areas, who particularly don't get reached out to because there's no reservation or there's no leaders, they're just there. And so that's one area I think of growth for states to focus on, is looking at their Native American populations in the urban areas and how do they reach out to them, because their messaging and the process to do that is a little bit different than when they talk to tribes on reservation. And so that's just something for the state, for the energy offices to keep in mind, hopefully. One thing I did want to mention about the community benefit plans, and maybe for Michelle and for others at DOE that are dealing with the hydrogen hub competition, is that my gut, because based on the couple of applicants that I've been dealing with, is that they're writing the community benefit plan to the application. They're not being innovative, is my opinion. So they're taking all the guidance. The way I interpret when I read the application is that was guidance. Here's some examples of what you could do to engage in your community. They're not looking at it as guidance. They're looking at it as how they're supposed to write the community engagement plan. So basically, some that I've seen are just regurgitating what DOE has already given out there, and I think that's hopefully there's time between now and the end, or when the applications are due, to sort of reach out for DOE to reach out to all the applicants that they've advised to move forward, is then to basically ask them to be innovative, move beyond what the guidance is, because that I you know, hopefully I'm wrong, but that would be one point, is move beyond the guidance. Also, within the community engagement plans, I know these applications they're very secretive. I mean, I've signed, I don't know how many non-disclosure agreements, and even then they won't share the information with me, because they're you know, there's so many billions of dollars at stake that they're very paranoid about their secret sauce, I guess, getting out. But that's the problem, is transparency. Is that a lot of the public, including tribes, feel like they're always continually being lied to. They want project developers who are transparent, including the states. And so when it comes to community engagement plans, please make those transparent, or DOE, please make those public, because they're treating those as private information, and eventually we as community members need to keep the toes to the fire, so to speak, of these developers. And the only way we can do that is that we have information. And if these community engagement plans are supposed to be for engaging with us, how do we measure that? How do we measure whether they're successful, or they're even doing what they say they're going to do? So those plans, hopefully, as much as information on the applications need to be publicly available. I've talked with folks from DOE, many folks from DOE that are dealing with the Justice 40 initiative. And because it's so new and there's not a lot of staff and everything, they're so overworked, that I think that a bunch of the developers, including the nuclear companies that are getting some of the Justice 40 monies, and some of the different battery guys that are covered under Justice 40, we don't know what, we know how much money they're getting lent. We know how much money that they're receiving. We just don't know how much of that is going to go to Justice 40 initiatives, when you know, 40% is 40% of the positive benefits, collective benefits from the federal side, are supposed to go to these projects, or to the disadvantaged communities. What I also say to the states and to the developers is 40% is a minimum. It's not the maximum. It's a, you know, to me, projects that hydrogen projects that go beyond the 40% and give a 50 or higher percent benefit to their communities, to me, have a better chance of winning. They're better applications than if you just get the minimum. But some folks are just looking at that as the maximum, and I think that's the wrong way to also look at this. You know, one example, and I'll just say this and I'll end with this, is in the community benefits plan of, I know one of the, I won't mention who, but one of the regions that's putting in, they mention loans, and that the loans to disadvantaged and minority communities are going to go up. But these projects aren't banks, and these projects, you know, they're supposed to be to build out hydrogen infrastructure, and so I don't know how they're going to, I don't know how they're going to give out loans, but also I don't know how they're going to make sure that loans are increased to these communities. So it's one of those things that's in the community engagement plan and community benefit plan, but it's really makes no sense right now why they would do this. That's just an example. But anyways, I know we're long, so I'll just end it there so that we can answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, and apologies that we went over time, but hopefully we can chat more about the work you're doing during the next 9 minutes of Q&A. So I know there's one question in the chat I wanted to start with, talking kind of about how folks are being identified as disadvantaged, concerns about being designated disadvantaged, and whether tribal government should be grouped into kind of that broader stakeholder engagement category. So maybe we can start with that last question. And Daniel, if you want to get started on that, kind of, have you heard any concerns from tribal governments about being grouped as a stakeholder? Would they prefer to be labeled a partner? Kind of what kind of engagement is most appreciated?
I think that that's always an issue, no matter what the development is. It's always been an issue for the, I've been in tribal leader for 30 years, and since I was 18, and over the last 30 years, tribes always have problems in this space. So it's nothing new, but I'm glad that it was mentioned. I think that states and developers and the problem is that the federal government has a trust relationship with tribes, direct, government to government. States don't. And local governments don't, and project developers don't as well. So the relationship is with the federal government to the tribes, and that's what they're used to. And so this is a little bit new. So I think that if there's just more communication with the tribe, I think labeling them as partners instead of stakeholder communities or stakeholders would probably go a long way towards resolving some of the issues, but it's an ongoing issue no matter what the issue is. So I would just say if you keep an open mind, if you communicate with the tribes in an honest and transparent way, they're going to tell you how they want to be labeled. But I agree, they shouldn't be labeled as just regular stakeholders. They need to be at a higher level because they are tribal governments. So I agree. And then on the disadvantage side, I think that that's the double edge of the sword, is that on one hand, being labeled disadvantaged under some of these programs will get you access to potentially resources as a community, but some communities don't want to be labeled as disadvantaged because it's a variety of measurements and they go over, I don't know how many, but if you hit the minimum amount of measurements, then you're labeled disadvantaged. But on the face of it, you may not seem disadvantaged. So I can understand their hesitancy when they're right on the edge of being disadvantaged. But like the other speaker said before, there's some areas that are 50%, 40%, 30%, and they understand being disadvantaged. But if you're just at the bare minimum, I think that's something that you as a community to figure out whether you want to participate and then again push that label. I'll just stop there.
Great, thanks. And yeah, Hadia and Michelle, do you have anything to add kind of about those concerns with folks being designated disadvantaged, or about some of the data used in the federal maps to identify disadvantaged communities?
I'll just put in two quick things. One is that there are a whole bunch of different federal tools, so you've probably come across those, or even state level ones, but I mean DOE has one and DOT has one. I know that CGEST has recently revamped dramatically based on community input, and I know DOE welcomes that as well. So I'm not, if anyone wants to get in touch on that, would be happy to try to push for whatever either incorrect designation or changes in designation that we'd love to hear from you on that. So it's still a work in progress.
Great, thanks. And Daniel, I see you might be typing an answer, but someone asked about how to identify tribal members living outside of designated tribal lands.
So I would just suggest, like as I mentioned in the response, was look at the census data. That's really good data by census tract. So if you're in an urban area, say Denver, it's easy to figure out how many natives, folks that identify as Native American that are there, and then be able to figure out at what level do you feel you need to engage? Basically, like how big is your state? What is the population of the natives in the state? And then at what level, what's the minimum level do you look at to engage with them? So if you're finding several thousand in your community or in a community, and you think that's enough to engage, then I would suggest start engagement. But at least get the data first. And like I said, the census data is going to be the best avenue to start with.
Great, thank you. And now I just wanted to see if you could talk through some kind of lessons learned from other failed or successful innovative clean energy projects that might be used as examples. I know, Hadia, you spotlighted the UK project, but I don't know if there's other examples you think states would benefit from looking at.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kelsey. I think, you know, when we think of some of the ones that have been controversial in the United States, certainly CCUS comes to mind, nuclear comes to mind. And what's interesting is that they, the common thread really is, one is sort of perhaps that there is a low level of technical understanding of the technology. And then at the same time, if you couple that with the fact that most people, including myself before I started this job, like, you don't sit around thinking about subsurface. That's not something that you normally think about in your day-to-day life. And so when you're being asked to believe or asked to imagine that you can take carbon out of the air and inject it back into the ground, so that most people, you know, understandably, reasonably would say, well, what's going to prevent it from coming right back up? Or they think of it as turning into some kind of like a bubble that then just explodes underground. And so that's, and I'm simplifying it, but I am pointing out that, you know, sometimes there is a significant lack of technical knowledge that can be a significant barrier to public acceptance. In other cases, I would say that when you don't have clear revenue streams for something that needs to have a clear revenue stream, and if a fossil fuel company is really going to just use that carbon to do enhanced oil recovery, that project is not really going to be viable, because you're going to get a lot of pushback from, again, reasonably and correctly, from environmental groups. So high upfront costs, not having clear revenue streams, and then, you know, not maybe having good technical understanding. The other bit I would say for nuclear was certainly like accidents, and then this idea of like affiliations. When we think of nuclear, and in some cases even hydrogen, like there's a 4-letter word starting with B that comes to mind. And, you know, if that's the first thing that people think of, the second thing they think of, that's not a really positive affiliation either. And with nuclear, the initial, in the early years, there were the accidents and the coverage of those accidents. I think people that saw that are not likely to forget it. So, you know, a lot of, obviously the technology has advanced considerably. We are making progress in so many ways. But a lot of times once those initial barriers have been set up, it's really, really hard to get people to change their minds about something. And what doesn't help is if there's any kind of obfuscation or even a whiff of it, because then you've really lost people, right? And at the moment, I mean, I hope it's appropriate to say this, but I think it's accurate. Most of the big players in the hydrogen scene are incumbent fossil fuel companies, because they have the resources to do this. So they actually have now a bigger burden to prove that things will be different if things didn't go so well in the past.
Great, thank you so much. Well, unfortunately, we're at time, but I hope that we can share these materials with everyone on the webinar today, and hopefully turn to the three of you as a resource going forward, because it's incredibly valuable to have these discussions. And I really appreciate all of you taking the time today. Have a great day.
Thank you.